The model view controller is a classic design pattern made to help us deal with the complexity we face when building visual applications. It does this through a simple separation of concerns by breaking our application into three parts: models, things that describe our data; views, things that display our data; and controllers, things that coordinate the interaction between our models and our views. You can imagine how complex things would get if we threw all of our data, views, and controlling logic all together in one big spaghetti class. It would be a mess. That's why iOS and other popular frameworks like Ruby on Rails use this pattern so heavily. It's money. Let's look at an example of the MVC design pattern in action. Say we wanted to change the text of a label when the user presses a button. Something like this. How would we do that in iOS? By default, when you create a new iOS application, you are already looking at MVC in action. You're given a view to contain your visual elements. You're given a controller to interact with your view. The only thing you're missing is data, or your model. But let's start by designing our view. So the first thing we'll do is we'll bring up our utility pane on the left-hand side here. We'll go find a label. Let's add a label to our view by dragging this out and placing it somewhere in the middle like this. I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger to make sure it can handle all the text. I'm going to give it some text like hello. And the next thing we want to add here is a button. So let's go find a nice rounded button, drag that out here, stick it somewhere in the middle, and we'll give it some text like tap me. So what we basically have here now is our view with some visual elements basically describing what it's going to look like. Before we can use this, I need to now hook up these visual elements to my view controller. We can do that by making a little bit of room here, bringing up our assistant editor, and what I'm going to do is just control drag these elements over to here. I'm going to start with the label. I'm going to click on my label, and while holding down control, I'm going to drag that over to my view controller.h file, and you should see a little pop-up insert outlet or outlet connection here. I'm going to let that go. I'm going to give this a title called my label. I'm going to go connect, and then I'm going to do the same thing. Actually, I don't need to do it for the button. I'm just going to do it for the label for now. All right, let's take a look at what that did for us. I'm just going to make a little bit of room here. When we dragged that label over, it created a property for us with a strong pointer, non-atomic. That's just kind of standard. Actually, we don't need this to be strong. This can be weak because this window will maintain a strong pointer to that label. So weak here is fine. IB outlet UI label my label. So this is basically just a property to my label. Now what's interesting is this little bit here, IB outlet. Whenever we drag a UI element in our Xcode to our view controller, you'll see words like IB outlet for variable, and shortly you'll see something else called IB action. IB outlets and IB actions are marker macros Xcode uses so the interface builder can tie these UI elements to your code. So if you see IB outlet and IB action, they really don't do anything for us code-wise. They're just there to help the IDE. The important thing to remember from this is just understand that we now have some UI elements connected to our view controller. In this case, we have a connection to our label, but what we'd like to do now is set up an action to this button. So I'm just going to flip to our viewcontroller.m file, and in here we have some boilerplate stuff that we get by default when we create a new view controller in a new project. So I'm just going to get rid of this. We don't actually need this. And you'll notice here in this version of Xcode, the synthesized my label, it didn't give us an instance variable. And this is a nice convention to put. Newer versions of Xcode in iOS don't even actually require a synthesize for our property, but this version does, so I'm just going to put this in here. Now the thing we're interested in is creating an action for our button. So very similar to label, I'm going to click on the button here. I'm going to hold down the control key. I'm going to drag this over to my view controller, and I'm going to look for that insert action. And here, I'm going to just specify type UI button. I'm going to give this a name like tap me pressed. I'm going to click the connect button here, and this creates an IB action for our tap me, where we can now do some work and write some code in here for what we want to see happen. Now I wanted to do this explicitly just to show you what our model is going to look like. In this case, I'm just going to create a string called model, and this is going to be the text that we're going to set on our label. So I'm just going to put the words here, goodbye. In a real program, model information might come from a database, it might be a data array or something more complex, but for our purposes here, this is fine. Now we've got our model defined. I actually want to set that. I want to change the label. So I'm going to access my label by going self.myLabel, which I can do because it's a property, and I'm going to set the text on that label to be the value of our model, in this case, goodbye. So if I do that, and come up here and click my run button, and eventually I should see this pop up in my simulator. And if I click the tap me, it changes to goodbye. Hey, it works, to the store. What we've just covered here forms the basis of almost every iOS program. Models holding data, views displaying it, and controllers linking the two together. Once you understand the basics of this design pattern, you'll have a strong foundation to start building your own applications, and a lot of things will start to become more clear in the iOS universe. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to the Model View Controller. If you have any feedback, questions, or suggestions for topics you'd like to see in future episodes, please drop me a line at feedback@therobotacademy.com.